Fantastic. I know my questions anyway. No, I'm totally kidding. I actually love questions. And please ask them at any point during class because sometimes I might not make sense. Like, it just, seriously.
It's possible.
It's very possible. I might not make sense. Or maybe, maybe we didn't make a connection. So if that's you, seriously, don't feel bad at all. I am not offended if you ask a question in the slightest. I really appreciate them. It helps me be a better teacher because if you didn't understand it, that probably means like half the people didn't understand it. So hopefully this week will make some sense though. Let's start with a word of prayer. Lord Jesus, thank you for bringing us here today. I'm so thankful that we are all able to be here and we can do this and have a discussion about stuff that can be challenging and challenge, or I can't even pray today. Thank you. That's what I'm looking for. Thank you, Lord. You can bring me the words that I don't have. So, yes, controversial. I pray that you can give our hearts the spirit of seeking truth rather than seeking rightness, which is really challenging for me as well as for, I think, most people. So I ask that we can follow your Son, who is the way, the truth, and the life, and see if we can figure out what is really true rather than rather than us being right. We pray this in your name. Amen. So today we're going to be just really diving into the science of evolution today. So we're going to talk about what the theory actually says and kind of why that actually is a problem for Christianity, which might be a challenge for some of you. So before we jump in today, I'm going to be asking you to be willing to challenge maybe the existing ideas that you currently have. I know I had to face this at one point in the past, and so I asked all of you to sort of be open to hearing something that might be a little different than you're used to. And
is this against Christianity?
No, it's not. It is not.
Okay.
Okay? We talked about week 1. Just a quick review for anybody who wasn't here for a couple of weeks. We talked about was there a beginning to the universe? What do you think?
Yes.
Yes, there was. Congratulations. We got it. And remember, things that are not infinite, things that didn't always exist, they have to have a cause to begin them. And so if the universe required a cause, that means there has to be something outside of the universe that caused it. Again, there are 2 competing theories for that. One is the multi-universe theory, which is absolutely no evidence for it, and we can't get evidence for it. So, you guys think we could find some extra chairs here somewhere? Thank you. You can tell your neighbor what the other theory was. It's his Sunday school answer, by the way.
Jesus.
You got it! Yes. Good job. Okay. It's an infinite creator. So, yeah, sorry we get crammed into this little room here and it gets a little bit tight. Okay? And you can decide whether you think that makes more sense or the multi-universe generating machine that you have no evidence for at all. I have my opinion on that. You can have yours. Week 2, we talked about how we see the natural forces of our universe like super finely balanced. A razor's edge does not even begin to compare in how finely balanced the universe is. And if anything is off in that really finely tunedness, the universe in some cases doesn't exist. In all cases, we don't get life, planets, stars, things like that.
So I wasn't here before, but and you probably already went over this, but is Big Bang, Big Crunch, Big Bang, Big Crunch, is that infinite?
That would be an example of how the universe could be infinite with a Big Bang. And they realized, again, it's been about 20 years. They used to teach that was the main theory, and they realized that just doesn't make sense. There isn't enough mass or gravity in the universe to crunch it back together. And it's not that close. We're off by quite a bit to get there. So if we're not crunching now, that means it wouldn't have been crunching in the past. So we wouldn't have an infinite number of crunches and then stop in this one, if that makes sense. So pretty much most scientists pretty much agree that is not what happened. Great question. Okay. Again, the point of this is when we see a balance, that implies intelligence. Remember the stack of rocks we saw on the top of the 14ers? We don't see that happening by accident. The balance implies somebody placed in there. It's not just random, it's not just low probability, but it seems to be designed for a purpose. You could have any random arrangement of things, very low probability, but when you see them balanced on top of each other, just in such a way that life can possibly exist, so the universe can exist, you see that that can be a sign for intelligence. Okay. We also talked about concept. We don't see aliens, right? We don't see aliens. If life were common and easy to develop, and this was something that was an accident, we would expect to see aliens. We'd expect to see a lot of them. And we see absolutely nothing, despite our best efforts and lots of space telescopes, some of which Tim worked on, I think. So we haven't seen it. So we were left with two, again, theories, the multi-universe theory. And again, it can't just be like a couple of universes. It has to be almost an infinite number. The mathematical term here is sufficiently large, which means a number so big that your brain would collapse into a black hole if you understood it. Okay? And I'm actually not joking on that. It needs to be that big. Okay? For your mathematicians there, I mean, Graham's number would be big enough. You familiar with Graham's number?
No.
Okay, it's a great one. You should look it up. It's really fun. And if you understood how big Graham's number is, your brain would collapse into a black hole. It's just too much information.
Is that why you're asking me to look it up?
Oh! That's good. Yeah. Skew's number would be big enough. You know that one. I was actually, that wasn't my intention. So yeah, I don't want you to collapse into a black hole. And the other possibility is that maybe something intentionally put this here. Was there an intelligent creator? And a theory we're sort of looking at is the idea of intelligent design. Okay, and we're going to deal with that a lot more today. And we do have evidence for this, because intelligent agents, things that are intelligent, we know have the ability to design things with a high degree of precision and balance. And so we see that there's actually evidence for that one versus multi-universe theory, which there isn't any evidence for. Okay, and again, Sir Fred Hoyle, a great quote. I don't know if you guys remember this one, but common sense interpretation of the fact suggests that a super intellect is monkeyed with physics, as well as chemistry and biology, and there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. In week 4, we talked about the idea that we see information in DNA, which I find to be an incredibly powerful argument. And information, in every case that we see it, is formed by an intelligence. There's 0 cases we've ever seen information being generated randomly. Okay, in no cases have we seen that. Therefore, DNA must have been created by an intelligent being. And that's kind of what we talked about last time. And we talked about the math of why it just doesn't make sense to assume it happened by chance. Unless, of course, you have an infinite number of multiverses. Okay? So if you think this is chance that did this, you are not correctly understanding the probabilities.
You might think that happened if you did correctly understand it.
Possibly.
Somebody.
But that's true. You can just think things that are wrong even if you understand them correctly. That is very true. Okay?
Or the multiverse also works.
It does work. It always works. It's a really nice fallback. Okay? So I think, again, all of this points towards intelligent design. And then, so just a quick review of what we see in terms of information. I went through this last time where you see stuff in clouds, you're like, huh, that looks a lot like a horse with wings.
Yeah.
I bet God designed that. And you're like, well, probably, yeah, I don't know. I mean, that could have happened by accident, right? And then you see something like maybe a little bit more.
Yeah.
Like, okay, God definitely designed that. Well, I mean, this could have happened by accident too. We can kind of, in your own mind, you sort of understand when you see information or not. Definitely accident. Okay? We always understand when we see where that barrier of information is and not. Remember we talked about this last time. The number of information, or the amount of information in your DNA is equivalent to a little less than 1,000 Bibles worth of text. Alright, so imagine somebody skywriting 1,000 Bibles worth of text, and you're like, yeah, definitely an accident. You wouldn't say that, right? So that's a quick review. There's a couple more fun ones. Look at this wonderful accidental rock formation happened by wind and erosion. And No, we see a purpose to this, right? We can immediately tell somebody put that airstrip there. This isn't an accident because it's designed for a purpose. It corresponds to an external idea. Again, we see another great example of wonderful wind and erosion working toward just happening to make these spaces. We know this is information because it's not just low probability, but it corresponds to something that has nothing to do with the rocks. Okay? That's the idea of information. And what we see in DNA is not just a low probability of DNA base sequences, but it corresponds to something that has nothing to do with the DNA, proteins. Okay? In the same way that we can see the rocks shaped into the faces of US presidents, we can also see DNA corresponding to something that has nothing to do with itself. And again, that's the hallmark of information, which is always created by intelligence. So there's a review of 4 weeks in 5 minutes. We did it. Okay? We're talking about evolution today, and if you question evolution, this is kind of what you're going to get. Because adults with imaginary friends are stupid. And a little underneath there it says, thank you for not littering your mind. This is kind of what you're going to see. The other thing is we're told that evolution is not a theory, that it's a fact, that it's been proven. And it says, don't believe in evolution because it's just a theory. Care to test your luck with the theory of gravity. And this is a guillotine, if you can't. All right, and this is essentially the perspective that most people in society have regarding evolution. And this is not uncommon. We see this all the time, and we want this too. We want to be right. Scientists want to be right. And so even when there's huge information, huge data, huge facts pointing against the theory of evolution, it basically one of the best ideas is to simply mock the opposite perspective. All right? Because what I'm going to challenge you today is I don't think evolution and Christianity work very well together. And we're going to talk about why, and which is the challenging piece for today. Because I think a lot of people just sort of assume, yeah, of course evolution is true and God is true. And Christianity is true. And I don't think those actually, I think they're mutually exclusive. And we're going to talk about why. Before we do that, we have to understand what evolution actually says. Okay? A guy in the 1800s named Charles Darwin came up with this idea. Probably heard of him. Pretty famous dude. Excellent scientist. He was far more willing to critique his own theory than modern scientists are, ironically.
You have that goal.
I do later, yeah. Okay, so there's 3 parts of evolution. And the first one is this idea of common descent, that all species are related. So the idea is that, okay, chimps are basically like humans with a little differences. And you can keep going backwards in time, and you can see that all species are sort of related together. Hopefully most of you are pretty familiar with that idea. All right? So that's the first part of it. The next piece of it is that there's an idea of natural selection. The natural selection is a little bit harder to see, but let's imagine for a second that you are a giraffe. All right? Some of you are short, some of you are tall. And unfortunately, there's a drought. And all the short trees, they aren't able to, their roots aren't deep enough, and they aren't able to get to the water deep in the ground. And so only the tall trees are the ones that have leaves that you can eat. All of the short giraffes out there, you guys are going to die off, leaving only the tall giraffes to survive. Because you survive, you can reproduce, and you pass on your tall giraffe genes. And so we see over time, species are supposed to, eventually they're going to weed out the less fit species. And so you have the idea that certain species are going to be better adapted to their environment, and the ones that are not well adapted are going to die off, and the ones that are well adapted will survive and pass on their genes. Okay? The thing that Darwin came up with is the idea that common descent, the fact that all species are related, actually can function through this exact same mechanism. All right? We've got a chair back there, and that's probably the best one for you. Okay? So again, the idea of evolution is that, again, common descent, the way that it happened, the reason all species sort of seem to be related is because of natural selection. Okay? And, that there's randomly different features in species, and over time, you could turn a zebra into a giraffe, for example. Because the zebra, longer neck zebras would be able to eat the trees or whatever. All right? So that's the idea of evolution. And so you have three parts of this. Now, if you have the first two parts, and the first two parts are true, that still doesn't mean that evolution is true. Evolution is only true if you get all three of those, and then the reason that we have all the different species, and they all seem to be sort of related, is because of natural selection acting on random changes. Okay? Remember we talked about random changes last time in DNA with the dice and stuff like that? Okay, so that is what we're talking about. Does that kind of make sense? Any questions on evolution and how those three parts work together? Because this is really important to understand. Okay? Keep in mind, there is nothing guiding this. This is totally random. Environmental forces are working on different species. And, for example, the drought, that's nothing intelligence needs to be there for a drought to happen, for a giraffe to get a taller neck or something. Okay?
Okay, so Darwin was what, late 1800s?
Yep.
Was he somewhere in there?
Yep.
And is what you just presented what he thought?
Yes.
Okay, so he had limited information because he didn't have genetics. And
Correct.
stuff like
It's
that.
what we understand of evolution today is usually known as neo-Darwinism, because they're applying Darwin's ideas to a modern idea of DNA, and we understand how changes in species happen now. Okay. So, but yes, this is essentially what he thought. He didn't necessarily know how these random changes happened. He just knew that, okay, so what if there just is, just somebody happens to be taller. Okay? Eventually, the taller giraffes will survive, and that's why they have such a long neck today.
But was Darwin going into origin science? Like, did he actually think that this explained how we evolved from amoebas and stuff like that?
Yes. The thing that he didn't understand was how life started in the first place, which we discussed a couple of weeks ago. But he assumed that once life gets going, that this is how everything happened. Okay? So there's a couple of things you need to understand about evolution because of this. First thing is that evolution has to be unguided because it's happening because of random chance, natural forces, things like that. Nothing is guiding evolution. If there's a guiding hand behind evolution, it no longer is evolution. Okay? I think I've got a bunch of text under here, but okay. What that means is that you can't have God as a part of it, or it's not evolution anymore. And here's a bunch of text you don't care about. Okay. Evolution is random. It has to be random. Because, again, if it's not random, the opposite of random is design. Yeah, planned, design, things like that. So it has to be random, and again, it can't be guided by any force. And again, what we understand today is that these natural changes had to happen in somebody's DNA. All right, and it's this basically saying, and a bunch of texts you don't care about. It says we're going to discuss all the math of that stuff, kind of like your question earlier. All right. The other thing that's really important to understand is evolution has to be gradual, because you can't get a zebra isn't going to turn into a giraffe overnight, and it certainly isn't going to turn into a whale and a monkey at the same time, right? You're going to see a gradual process. That is happening over large spans of time. And what people were starting to discover in Darwin's day is how old the Earth really is. That it's over 4 billion years old, and that's a really long time for some of this stuff to happen. So they assume, okay, this can happen really gradually. All right, so these are the three things here.
But that gradual is relative.
Yes, oh, absolutely.
Like I said last week, Stephen Gould championed punctualism because gradualism was just ridiculous, but
Correct.
Nobody believes gradualism. Conditions change, and then that means that the criteria for survival change.
Absolutely.
And so there's going to be, a lot of change when conditions change.
Well, right. So without the drought, you're not going to get the tall giraffes.
Right.
But what you're not going to get is, again, giraffe turning into a pterodactyl. that
Yeah.
would take a lot of time.
Yeah.
And that's what we're seeing, again, we can see changes within species, like a wolf's coat could go from
But
black to white very
that-
quickly.
But that doesn't happen, giraffes don't turn into pterodactyls, something down here branches.
Correct, and that's gradual. Again, that's what I'm talking about. So the idea of gradualism, again, I'm not talking about that, I'm not, and evolutionists are not trying to say that, like, oh, things can happen at different speeds. But what you are saying is you're not going to see these big radical changes like that. You're going to see, okay, it might speed up a little bit here because there's conditions like a drought or whatever, and then, then it might split off into a couple different ones, and then that might, but you're going to see slow spreading of species.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Which is accepted.
Okay.
All right.
I lost the point there, sorry.
Species
The
doesn't
point,
change.
the point being,
Species doesn't change.
well, now you're saying that there isn't punctuated equilibrium or whatever they call it.
Well, that's okay. We'll talk about that in a minute, but we'll discuss punctuated equilibrium. But again, that wouldn't be like, again, that would be like, okay, there's not a lot of change. Okay, there's quick change, and then there's not a lot of change, and then there's quick change. But again, what you're not seeing is in that quick period of change, you don't see a bat turning into a whale. You see a bat turning into two different kinds of bat, or a wolf changing very quickly into a white wolf versus a gray wolf. You see a giraffe with a longer neck. What you're not seeing is the giraffe turning into 6 different species.
But wouldn't they say that you are seeing that in the fossil record?
That's the problem, because that shouldn't happen according to any sort of Darwinism, and there's no mechanism for that, which we are going to talk about today. Okay.
All right.
You guys are getting ahead of me. Okay? This is a fun one. Alright? It's an altar. It says evolution is a fact, and the guy says, I will not question evolution. We're going to question it. Okay? Yeah, right. Evolution is a fact. And here's some of the reasons why, right? We can see species change over time, and this is kind of what I've been talking about. And we actually see evidence for this. So you start with a wolf, a couple thousand years,
We should have used a little, thinking.
okay? We see a little dog like this, a couple hundred years more.
Oh, there it is.
And these are all the same species. We see species change over time. This happens. And this is essentially what Darwin was observing.
Yeah.
And he assumed that that means that this could eventually turn into a rat. And he's not wrong.
But wasn't a lot
Wait.
of that guided anyway? I mean, humans breeding.
That's an excellent counterpoint, Christy, that this is actually purposeful when we see change this radical and this fast. Humans had to be actively breeding species to make them change this quickly, which is an interesting counterpoint. But we do see that species can change over time. Okay? Common descent is almost irrefutable because, again, we do share 99.7% of our DNA with chimps. You see another DNA evidence. All plants, for example, use the same enzyme, which is a kind of protein, to photosynthesize. Every plant, same exact protein, which is kind of cool. It's called rubisco. You don't need to know the rest of those words. But rubisco for short. By the way, if you ever see these words,
We're never.
like if you ever see stuff like this in a weird word, carboxylase, you see this ase suffix at the end of a word, that's referring to a specific kind of protein called an enzyme. Okay, so if you ever see that word showing up in some kind of science thing, like, oh yeah, that's an enzyme. I'm smart now. Okay? We share a bunch of DNA with chimps, 99.7%.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. It's almost the same. Okay? And so here's the big question, is it possible to believe in evolution and Christianity? Okay, there's lots of seeming evidence to support evolution, and we've already talked lots of evidence to support Christianity, and it certainly is possible. People do it all the time. Parts of it are undisputed and consistent. For example, common descent. Okay, but remember, common descent actually doesn't prove evolution is true. It's one of those 3 pieces. All right, and it's actually, for me, you can decide how you want to look at it. But I don't actually see common descent as being evidence for evolution.
Wouldn't common descent, if you take it all the way back to what Darwin was talking about, wouldn't that say that we would have, both plants and animals would have evolved from the same?
Yeah, and both of them would have come out of single-celled organisms, both of them, and single-celled organisms would have come out of bacteria, bacteria would have come out of archaea. I mean, like, yeah, that's the idea. Okay? I actually, again, we'll talk about this here. We'll talk about natural selection. Again, I already sort of mentioned that, antibiotic resistance. We see natural selection acting on species now too. And we see antibiotic resistance. We see bacteria that don't die from antibiotics. They have survived in an environment, like, okay, the environment is now filled with a toxic chemical. That's like a drought for the giraffe, right? So all of the bacteria that aren't resistant to this die off, leaving only one that's not. Okay, so we see these parts of these things. The question is, can you believe in both of them? Three is the issue. Did all of this happen as a part of random mutations and chance and stuff over billions of years? Unfortunately, it's not a coherent belief system to believe in both evolution and Christianity. And this is the part that might challenge some of you.
It's challenged me.
Yeah, it does. And it's a problem because it undercuts the foundation of our faith. Because what do we believe that God did? Created the world with a purpose leading to us. If evolution is true, that means that God is not a creator, designer, intending everything to be built for us to be the pinnacle of it. It's a completely different story. We're an accident, if evolution is true.
Yeah, but, I mean, isn't he just like really good at pool?
Okay, well then he designed it from the
He
beginning.
just like set it in motion and then.
Sure.
Ta-da.
Well, and right, but
yeah.
see, if he's really good at pool, then he's got a razor's edge balanced thing from the beginning, and he's beating those 1 in a trillion odds all the time.
Right, it'd be like can a computer generate a random number thing?
Yeah, I mean, can a computer randomly generate all of Shakespeare's works? Well, sure. But like, if it did, I wouldn't be thinking that it was an accident. I would be thinking, this is probably designed. And if you see something really precisely, I mean, it could have been an accident. Like, God could have done it that way. But either way, like, he's overcoming ridiculous odds all the time. And so it's there. And he's not sustainer either. Because that means that he hasn't maintained the earth throughout its history. Stuff's been an accident, things like that. And it also means humans aren't made in his image. All right? And we're forced to ask the question, because again, we'd be asked, there isn't anything special about humans, they're just, well, we're just the best thing so far. Right now. A couple of million years, we won't be the best thing. All right, and lastly, it asks the question, I think this is the most challenging one for me. If God didn't care enough to specifically design us, why would he care enough to die for us? I think all of this actually stems on whether evolution is true or not. I think it's a really challenging thing that we have to answer, particularly for those of us, including me, who at one point sort of said, well, yeah, evolution is true and Christianity is true. But they don't go together.
That's kind of by definition.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, they don't go together. If you at some point say, well, yeah, God just like led evolution along, then it's not evolution anymore.
If you didn't say that evolution has to be random and not by intelligent life,
Correct.
then it could be all the rest of it.
Sure.
True, and that's the mechanism that God used to create us.
Sure, but again, then it's not random and it's not
Right.
by accident.
Yeah.
He said, I'm going to change this piece of a chimp's DNA to make it into a human. I'm going to adjust this zebra to turn it into a giraffe or whatever. Right? I'm going to change this. All of them then become purposeful. Because actually, believe it or not, common descent that we see actually is not at all a good proof for evolution. It's always taken as one. Saying, well, yeah, you see all this relationship. We see this, we see these different things. Like, how do we still have 50% of our DNA in common with bacteria? That doesn't even make sense. We do. That's crazy. The thing that's interesting is that doesn't actually imply at all accident or evolution. I'll show you why. I have a really good example of how you can have this and have it not be evolution. Okay? I want to take a look at the Ford Mustang. Okay? And I want to see if you can see any similarities between some of these cars. Maybe a gradual improvement, perhaps. Are they changing over time?
Yes.
Person was the best.
Are they improving? No,
No.
not this
No.
one. No, they're not. Okay? Is it adjusting?
Yeah.
Are they adapted to their environment? Okay? Or are they getting faster? Could there possibly be a way that stuff could be related and have it not be an accident? I don't know. I can't possibly see how there could ever be a similarity between things. It is. It is. This is the Mustang Mach-E SUV. Okay, it's their electric one. Okay, do you see a similarity between any of those things? Was there a common descent? Yes! Does this share a lot of the bones of the original Mustang from the 60s? Yes. Has it improved and changed? Yes. Did it have anything to do with accident or randomness? No. Okay, for me, what I see, and any engineer out there would tell you, if you see improvement and gradual iteration over time, that should tell you that somebody is improving on this and designing it and changing it on purpose. To me, this isn't an accident. This isn't evidence for evolution at all. Common descent tells me God's like, whoa, I've already got this photosynthesizing thing in a flower. Maybe I'll put it in a tree. That's cool. And I've got this chimp is pretty cool. Maybe I'm going to change a couple things and make it into a human. To me, that screams design. It has nothing to do with evolution or chance. Okay, so it doesn't have to be one or the other, and most people will point to common descent and be like, look at all these things, they're all related. Can't you tell? Yeah. Looks like they were designed to me. So you can look at it either way, but I think one of them makes a lot more sense because, again, we actually see examples of this in real life. Something gradually changing because of intentional purpose. Even the dogs, as you were mentioning, was an intentional change on purpose. What we don't see is accidental things like this. Like, we don't put a fire in the Mustang factory and be like, wow, it got better. No, it's always designed that improves stuff over time. And I love that slideshow. I think it's really fun. So, let's get back to this one. So again, I don't think it's a consistent belief system. So we're going to take a look at some challenges to evolution because I don't believe that Christianity and evolution play nice together. I don't think they match. I don't think Christianity and evolution can both be true. You either have to believe that God designed stuff or he didn't, and at no point is evolution a part of it. You can believe in common descent. You can see natural selection happening, but that doesn't mean that evolution is true. Okay, and so we're going to be taking a look at some of the evidence and some challenges to evolution. There's 3 basic challenges. Yeah?
I have to articulate to make sure it's actually right in here.
Do it.
So, because evolution has as a necessary component of its definition, random cause. I mean, well, I don't know if you can say random.
Random
cause.
or accidental or
Okay.
nothing guiding it.
So, if I believe as a Christian that God designed is incompatible with random
Correct.
accidents.
Those are exact opposites.
So I can accept the other 2 if I wanted to, and
Yes.
you're probably going to blow those away too. But I could accept the other 2 components of
Yep.
evolution, and
Exactly.
it would be fine.
Exactly.
I just can't accept the randomness part.
Correct.
Okay.
And again, we have a ton of evidence supporting those other 2 things. So believing those would be compatible. And again, because again, the idea of Christianity is we're following the way, the truth, and life. We're looking for truth. We're not looking to be right. And so if we see truth happening in science, and it's sort of irrefutable, we can look at the DNA. It's the same. Right? Common descent is there. We can watch bacteria not die from antibiotics. That's there. We can't, don't deny it, because it's we can see it, it's happened, right? And neither of those are incompatible with God being our creator. Again, we can see that the Mustang changes over time. That actually, to me, is a supporting evidence of it. When we see things being repurposed from one thing to another and being put together like that. I'm sure you probably use different thermal stuff in different spacecraft, right, Tim?
And you do it so you don't have to keep on making stuff. You don't have to reinvent the wheel.
You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can use something that works, and you can use it maybe in a different way or in a different area. Yeah.
So I'm guessing Darwin was a pretty smart guy,
He was.
and he probably realized that, explaining things with microevolution would not explain how you got these really complicated species.
What Darwin did not understand, again, this is 1800s, we didn't know about DNA. We didn't know about the complexity of the cell. We didn't know anything back then. We thought the cell was basically a little blob of goo wrapped in a bubble. And when you look at something and you see it's simple, it wouldn't be as big of a leap back then to believe that it could have changed more easily. Like a small change to that little bubble of weird, so maybe that gives it 3 bubbles or something. And so Darwin, again, I don't think that, his theory was bad at the time. It's just bad now.
Well, is he sort of been misunderstood? Like, did he not take it that far was his theory truly saying that everything evolved over 4 billion years and that's how we got all these complex species?
Yeah, that's what he said.
Then why did he make that jump? Because he must have understood that.
Well, he's taking a small period of time where we see a wolf turning into a chihuahua. And he said, well, if you have 1 billion years, like, that's a big change, right? And so he's extrapolating out, which we do a lot in science. We take a little bit of information, we extrapolate it out. And that's very common, and that's why it's a theory, because we don't really know for sure, but we're taking a little bit of data that we can see, and we're going to fast forwarding, in his case, rewinding and saying, okay, this seems to make sense.
Can I please use the restroom?
Absolutely, thank you for
So
asking.
if he was defending himself, would he say, if he was here today, would he say, look, you guys I just had a theory, I didn't have perfect.
He had a theory, and he was willing to criticize his own theory far more than we are today. And he would have looked at DNA and be like, you guys are dumb. We need a new theory. That's probably what he would say. Actually, he'd probably look at it really carefully and analyze it, look at all the data, and he'd say, I don't think this makes sense with the advent of discovery of DNA. Okay. So we're going to take a look at these 3 pieces over the next few weeks. And so the first one we're going to look at today, we have about 20 minutes left. So fossil evidence does not show gradual change. If that's the case, that's a huge, and again, you could speed up or slow down, but if you are not slowly, gradually branching out by species like this, if you start with all the differences at the bottom, that's a big problem. Okay? The other thing is, if chance proves mathematically insufficient to produce observed changes, we will discuss that in more detail. And then Darwin's biggest challenge is that there could be biological systems that could not be built up gradually. If you can't make a system by small changes, then it doesn't really make sense. For example, you look at a Mustang. You can take out an air conditioner and it still works. So adding an air conditioner, sure, that's great. You can take out a radiator if you have the hood off, it still works. If your muffler doesn't work, your Mustang still drives. If you don't have a roof or a windshield, it still works. If your seats are broken, it still works. But there's a certain point, and so his idea was like, okay, we'll just eventually get all the way down to a bicycle or something. But there's a certain point where if you could find a mechanism in biology where it doesn't work at all unless you have a whole bunch of pieces to begin with, it's called an irreducibly complex system. So you can't reduce it. Anyway, we'll talk about that next week. Okay, so these are the 3 challenges. Today we're talking about number 1. Because we have to base on what we actually know and not based on what we think we know or what we hope is true. We're going to talk about something called the Cambrian Explosion. So we begin with this idea of the tree of life that Darwin started with. This is a sketch from one of his notebooks. And it's kind of famous where he's got this little tree, and the idea is that there was originally one organism that slowly branched off. Maybe you've got cells of the nucleus, they're called eukaryotic cells, and you get all of animal life, where here is this bacteria life, things like that. And so he wrote, I think. It's a really famous picture of his notebook. And I think this is kind of what the tree of life looks like. People make like jewelry out of it. tattoos out of it? And if you read the notes underneath, it's pretty obviously a biology class this person's in. And so you can kind of get more of a picture of what the tree of life is sort of like in Darwin's view. Where you're starting with some sort of early cell, single cells, and you get all these different kinds of animals slowly branching off of it. Okay, eventually at the top, you see there's a dog. Dogs and humans are very similar. Both vertebrates, same phylum, chordata, all that stuff. Okay, we're going to take a look at something called the Cambrian Explosion. The Cambrian Explosion is sometimes called biology's Big Bang. And this is fossil evidence. So, Cambrian Explosion began approximately 542 million years ago. It's a long time ago. And in this period of time, about 5 to 20 million years, 30 to 38 new phyla were created or evolved. Anybody familiar with the term phylum? Anybody? Phylum, anybody know what that is? You're not sure? Okay. So basically, the idea of a phylum is like a huge group of animals or species of any kind. It's the biggest class underneath kingdom. So kingdom is like plants and animals, right? Those are kingdoms. Underneath, the next biggest one after kingdom is a phylum, or phyla is the plural. Okay, so we see in a 5 to 20 million year period, 30 to 38 new phyla being emerging, created, evolved, whatever you want to call it.
Based on fossils,
Correct. The disagreement of whether it's 30 or 38 comes from we don't have enough information to determine whether this slightly different body plan is a different phyla or they're really the same. So it's at least 30. It could be as many as 38. Any guesses? Okay, here we go. Phylum is the third largest category. Cool. Anybody have any idea how many phylums or phyla are in the world today? Good guess. 35. All the life on Earth right now is classed in 35 phyla. 30 to 38. Again, some of those have gone extinct. But basically, it represents more than half of the phyla that have ever existed in the history of Earth. It's something like, again, depending on whether it's 30 or 38, it's like 60 to 70% of all the phyla that have ever existed. Okay, so an example of a phylum, just so you can get an idea of it, we belong to the phylum Chordata, and these are some of the examples of animals that live in this phylum and how varied that big group of animals could be. So everything from turtles to birds to whales to people is all in the same phylum. So this is a big group of animals. We're not talking about there's a worm and this is another worm. They're different phyla. No. We're talking about huge variety, and they all, basically we say the phylum Chordata is defined by people that have a backbone, so a spine. Anything with a spine and a skeleton is going to be in this phylum. Okay, and here's some pictures of some fossils that we see from the Cambrian Explosion, the Cambrian era. Just some really cool looking fossils. Very, very strange body plans. Again, many of them are extinct and we don't see them today. Now, right here is probably one of the ones you've heard of before. It's called the Trilobite. They were around for a really long time. Here's another one of the Trilobite. And this poses a problem to the theory of evolution. Can anyone see why?
It's not a gradual change.
Not even close to gradual. Yeah, we see, and again, we see bacteria is pretty much the only organisms we saw for about 3 billion years, and then boom, in a 5 million year period, we see almost everything that we've ever seen on Earth emerging. And instead of a slow, gradual branching, we see all the big changes first, and then it's changed from there. But we're not seeing at all anything gradual, even by the most generous speeding up of things. You see the difference here.
You probably have 1,000 Phyla.
Correct. If it continued in this at this speed, a lot more than that.
Yeah.
A lot more than that. So yeah. Okay, so I want to show you guys a video here, and hopefully it will work. But the internet doesn't seem to be working today, so hopefully I've stored up enough internet that it'll work. Let's hope.
If homology doesn't provide evidence for the tree of life,
I'm gonna go turn this off quick. So you can
a
see that.
second proof usually offered is the fossil record. According to most biology textbooks, fossils show the gradual development of life from simple to complex over hundreds of millions of years. But a growing number of scientists say that this textbook story is incomplete and even misleading, because it ignores an extraordinary event in the history of life known as the Cambrian Explosion.
Cambrian explosion is a term that refers to the geologically sudden appearance of most of the major groups of animals at about the same time, geologically speaking.
Most geologists date the Cambrian explosion at 530 to 520 million years ago.
The Cambrian explosion is a name given to a geologic event, really, the appearance in the fossil record over a period of about 10 million years or slightly less of skeletonized fauna that includes many living phyla for the first time.
Animals with similar body plans are grouped together to form various phyla.
Indeed, if you look at the tree of life, you can infer that nearly or all living phyla had evolved by the end of the explosion period. The Cambrian explosion has been called life's Big Bang, or at least animals' Big Bang, because in the Cambrian explosion, most of the major forms of animals appear very suddenly in a geological sense. From nothing, we have almost everything, almost overnight, geologically speaking. This remains mysterious. Nobody really understands how this happened. The explosion is real in the sense that the fossils are real. There they are. Explaining it, however, is controversial. We're not sure just how far back animals originated before the explosion, or what the events were that led up to it. In Darwin's theory, if you think of the branching tree, Darwin's branching tree, the common ancestor down here and the different modern forms of animals up here, you would have one form to begin with, and then it would gradually diverge into slightly different forms and more different, until you get the major differences that we see now. The problem with the Cambrian explosion is that all these major differences appear together at the same time, with no fossil evidence that they descended from this common ancestor.
You have a sudden emergence of new biological form and structure. And the suddenness of it defies the Darwinian mechanism's ability to produce new structure. Darwin believed that his mechanism must act slowly through small, gradual, incremental changes. And as a result, he expected to find many transitional intermediate forms from the very simplest organisms to the first animals.
Darwin knew about the Cambrian fossil record, and he considered it a serious problem for his theory. He hoped that future fossil collecting would fill in the gaps somewhat and make the theory more plausible. But in fact, 150 years of continued fossil collecting have made the problem worse. Many more types of animals were involved than Darwin knew about. So it's actually more of an explosion now than Darwin thought it was.
Most biology textbooks, however, supply little information about the Cambrian explosion, if they even mention it at all.
My textbook gives a one-sentence statement, just that there was this Cambrian explosion of life. But then it goes on to give a traditional Darwinian theory as to this slow, gradual evolving process.
DeHart wanted to supplement the solitary sentence in the biology textbook with an article that appeared in the Boston Globe. The article reported on cutting-edge research by Chinese scientist J.Y. Chen, an internationally respected paleontologist at the Nanjing Institute of Paleontology and Geology. Chen's discoveries in the fossil beds in Xinjiang, China, have rocked the scientific establishment. Located in the province of Yunnan in southern China, Xinjiang has some of the world's best preserved fossils from the Cambrian era.
Darwinism helps them maybe only telling a part story for evolution.
According to Chen, the fossils he's discovered turn Darwin's tree of life upside down.
Darwin's tree reverse constitute very unexpectedly. Our research is convincing major Phyla starting Untitled at the beginning of Cambrian. Base is white, gradually narrow, so this is almost turned on differently.
I do not believe that animals develop gradually from the bottom up. I think the animals suddenly appeared. Among the Xinjiang animals, we have found 136 different kinds of animals, and they represent diversity in the level of phyla and classes. So the sudden appearance makes them very special.
One view that many paleontologists hold is that though the phyla appeared suddenly during the Cambrian explosion, there must have been a long period of evolutionary development before that event.
Some people believe that it was a very rapid origin of these body plans. Other people believe there's this long, gradual build-up to it, which I think is probably right. But there must have been a prehistory in which it started at the bottom and worked up to the phyla.
If there was a long history of evolution prior to the Cambrian explosion, there should be an abundance of transitional fossils. Or perhaps those animals were too small or soft-bodied to be preserved.
The Darwinists have known since the 19th century that the Cambrian explosion did not conform to the picture of life that Darwin proposed. But one of their explanations for that was something called the artifact hypothesis, the idea that we were simply not sampling the fossil record sufficiently to find the missing transitional intermediates. In the strata just beneath the Cambrian fossil beds, we have a very favorable environment that would have preserved ancestral forms of these animals had they existed. So one of the versions of the artifact hypothesis was the claim that we don't find these missing Precambrian animals because they were too small and they were soft-bodied. And what we now find in the Chinese fossils, in the beds just beneath the Cambrian explosion, are perfectly preserved, soft-bodied tissues, sponge embryos. They're, of course, soft and microscopic. The new finds in the Xinjiang formations really completely put to rest the artifact hypothesis. If you can preserve an embryo, you can preserve an animal. And if those animals were there, then we should have found them. And they're not there.
Some defenders of Darwin's theory argue that random mutations in a special set of genes called Hox genes are responsible for dramatically speeding up the evolutionary process during the Cambrian period.
But what's interesting to me is that these genes are turned on late in development, long after the body plan is established. A fruit fly is already a fruit fly embryo before the Hox genes kick in. The same for a human, or a worm, or a starfish.
So without a mechanism for sudden mutation, or a record of transitional fossils, Critics say Darwin's theory lacks the evidence it needs to account for the remarkable Cambrian explosion.
I'm really glad that still plays despite not having internet. Again, it's this is from a movie called Icons of Evolution. That's the name of this movie. This is the little small section of it. I'll send a link out if you guys want to watch the rest of it. Okay. I think it's fantastic, or fascinating to see all this stuff. Because again, what we're seeing, instead of the tree of life slowly starting as simple and getting more complex, we actually see complexity at the bottom. And this is kind of the best diagram we have right now of something sort of kind of like what we see in the fossil record. But you see it's complex all the way down. There wasn't, we don't see a slow, gradual change. And again, remember, evolution has to be gradual. It has to be random. Do you think the Cambrian explosion is either of those things? I don't think so. And in short, challenge number one, the concept of the tree of life and the gradual, slow changes that we expect to see if evolution is true, what we see in the fossil record is not explained by evolution. The fossil record, it is in direct contradiction to evolutionary theory, which is good because, you know, again, you can't, again, I don't think that Christianity and evolution go together, so it's nice if one of them is false. Okay. But again, one of the best counter-arguments to this is, again, mocking the idea of evolution being wrong. So, it's atheist reflections. 1 in 3 Americans don't believe in evolution? Wow. 1 in 3 Americans didn't believe in Iraq until we invaded them a second time. It's actually 1 in 3 biologists, though. That's what you should have said. Interestingly, they're far more likely to be a biologist in Europe or Asia that is able to accept the evidence. American biologists are almost exclusively atheistic or evolutionary or neo-Darwinian. Because again, what we see in our country is a very strong desire to be right. It's in our American DNA. Even when the evidence contradicts it, we're unable to say, oh, I must be wrong. And again, for whatever reason, we see in other countries, other parts of the world, far more willingness to accept some of this evidence and say, well, man, that doesn't really make sense. It actually doesn't work with evolution. In our country, we don't do that perspective. Okay? What's the best argument? Again, I'm trying to give you the best counter arguments. Big one is just to deny the observed facts in question. So that's what they do in textbooks. They just kind of ignore them. Again, we see that in, and I was going to bring a biology textbook today. It's 2 sentences in the textbook about the Cambrian explosion. That's it. And the one we use in our school. So that's all it is. And we have a lot of information. It's a really fantastic period and fossil record. And we don't talk about it at all. So we just deny them, and then we can ignore them, and then it fits a little better.
But we kind of do the same thing. I mean, you know, the Darwinians at their altar, you know, people that are that way, is because they can't see and recognize all the facts because they're too complex, which is a lot of the problem that we have, other than having, you know, this sort of education, which, you know, it's just hard to have. It's just hard to really be smart and intelligent.
I don't want to blame anybody for what they think. Again, this is me for a long time. I'm not trying to accuse anybody. And I think we all do this. We want to be right. We don't, and challenging our own beliefs is actually really hard. It's really hard to do.
Educational systems to put stuff in the textbook. Will it ever happen? I don't know.
I don't know either. But it's a really great point. And it's good to remember that we need to, again, my whole idea, we talked about it first week, where we need to be Christians, even if we see stuff that doesn't make sense. And we're like, how could you believe this? Like, no. We need to be Christians all the time. And we need to be kind and empathetic and treat people with respect and recognize that that could be us just as easily. And it's a really important reminder. I really appreciate you saying that. So, there is a cool word some of you already mentioned today, punctuated equilibrium. or one of the ways that we come up with that there's often explanations to explain away some of this data is by coming up with a cool vocab word. Like remember we talked about abiogenesis? It's a really cool vocab word, explains nothing about the origin of life. Punctuated equilibrium is a really cool vocab word, it actually doesn't explain anything. The idea is that species are stable, and then periodically there's rapid evolutionary development. I think it's a cool vocab word, thank you very much. Okay, and basically there's equilibrium that's punctuated by change. But the idea is that, well, if we come up with a name for it, then that means that evolution explains it, and that's not true at all. Seeing 38 phyla show up in 5 million years, it doesn't explain by any of this, even if you give it a name. It's important to recognize the difference between vocab and an actual explanation, and this is one of those cases, where this describes what we see without actually giving any sort of mechanistic explanation to explain how this could have happened apart from by design. Okay? Is there any evidence to support this theory? Again, no. Punctuated equilibrium doesn't actually explain anything. It literally is just a word to describe what we see. Just like abiogenesis, there's no mechanism to explain. It just says, well, at some point, life had to come from non-life. No, it didn't. Okay? That doesn't actually explain anything. Oh, here, this is fun. I had a really cool slide. Is there any evidence to support this? No. Okay. I think it's fun, and don't... My mom and my wife are both heckling me from the back over here. You were heckling me too. It's okay. So one of the best counterexamples is, well, intelligent design, the idea that there was an intelligent designer that had a hand in this, isn't science. That's the most common argument I hear about this. So therefore, since yours isn't science, ours is still better. And they mock this. This is a funny cartoon. I like this one. Okay, so there's this science teacher and says, okay, so much for today's biology lesson in intelligent design. Now we're turning to the subject of intelligent geography. And you see a flat earth with a ship falling off the end of it. But this is kind of the best argument against it, is just to mock the other side. But let's think about what good science actually is.
And we have to be careful about them to not misrepresent what science is and look at it wrong, too.
Correct. Let's think about what good
science is. We do that as Christians, or a big part of the Christian community does.
We should try to. Okay? And let's think about what good science is. The theories should match existing facts. If they don't, they should change. A good theory doesn't need to be adjusted very often. So Einstein's theory of relativity is exactly the same equations he came up with in the very early 1900s. I mean, they're perfect, and every test we can do confirms them. We haven't adjusted those equations at all, with the exception of the cosmological constant, which we found out was still right after we fixed it, so we went back to the original. So general relativity is a fantastic theory. Inflationary theory, which we talked about, is constantly being adjusted. Every week there's a new number, there's a new idea. It's just this big conglomeration of weird changing theories all the time. And theories should be able to make predictions that can be tested and proven. So, for example, evolution predicts a slow, gradual branching of life, and that's not what we see. So again, everything about science says this is not a good theory. The question is, does intelligent design factor into that at all? And it turns out that it does. Because there's some things that we should predict, and some intelligent design scientists have predicted. It's often mocked as not being a theory, that you can't test it, but you can. And there have been predictions that have been tested. So for a long time, we thought that something like 80 to 90% of our DNA was, quote, junk. Because remember, we talked about a very simple explanation of what DNA does, is it takes little sections of it that correspond to proteins. Remember that? Most of DNA actually doesn't code for proteins. So the idea was that the rest of it is kind of junk. It's an artifact of evolutionary change, and it's just sort of leftover refuse, and we don't use it. Intelligent design scientists said, no, we think it probably is all useful. We think we wouldn't expect a designer to make a code where most of it's gibberish. Turns out that's true. It was a prediction against all of the scientific evidence of the time. Came out to be true. Turns out 80 to 90% of DNA, and some scientists think up to 99% of our DNA does have a purpose. There isn't junk DNA in it.
So how long ago was that junk DNA theory in place, and how long ago was it?
It was, once we started, it started after the Human Genome Project. We realized and that was the late 90s, and we realized that most of our DNA didn't code for proteins. Like, wow, what's the rest of this? Intelligent design scientists are like, we think the rest of this is important. And the rest of them are like, no, that's not important. And it turns out that it is important. So for example, how do the different proteins react together? We actually don't understand a lot of the rest of the code yet. But it does have a very big importance in how the cell is put together on a bigger scale. The appendix is a great example. Appendix was often used as an example of evolution as this vestigial organ, we usually say. It was important in the past in some previous organism, it's not important now, but evolution hasn't gotten rid of it yet. Turns out the appendix is important, again predicted by intelligent design scientists. The appendix essentially functions as a safe room in your colon for your bacteria that allows you to survive. So it's, for example, you have a big horrible thing and your bacteria die, your appendix helps repopulate the bacteria in your gut. Really an important thing. You can live without it, but just like you can also live without one of your kidneys. But it doesn't actually help your life expectancy. You shouldn't just cut it out of everybody when they're born. It serves a purpose, again predicted by intelligent design scientists.
All right, so I think that the evolutionists would say something like, well, you're not adding enough time and planets and the size of the universe and all that stuff, because what we perceive as an explosion or design is actually just more randomness, just like an explosion is an explosion.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the guy was trying to explain it in the video by saying, well, I think there was all this, gradualism going on that resulted in an explosion, and it looks like an explosion when you look at it, but it was all, it really all comes down to whether there were outside causes, I think.
Sure. Well, and what we see is that it wasn't gradual at all. Again, you can see right before the Cambrian explosion, you're able to preserve these really small microscopic one-celled organisms that were there. And if you can preserve a soft microscopic organism, you could preserve a fish or something. The same things are there. We're almost done. I'm sorry, guys. Hope you guys have a good one. But what you're not seeing, again, there is no fossil record whatsoever. The fossils record says there was one-celled organism and then all these multi-celled organisms. And that's all we see. So that's what the evidence actually says versus something else, okay? So I mentioned this, irreducibly complex systems, that's next week, and that they're everywhere in life. It was predicted by intelligent design scientists before we found them. Now we found them everywhere. And the complexity and interconnectedness within the cell. These are all things that were predicted, testable, and we were able to find them in the cell, all predicted because of an intelligent design hypothesis. Yeah.
So, the fossil evidence, there's a counter argument. I have a counter
I'd love to hear it.
argument for that evidence of evolution. Somebody could have just carved the fossils to trick people.
That's true, and that totally wouldn't have been an intelligent cause either.
That totally wouldn't have been it.
Somebody trying to trick you sounds like an intelligent cause to me too.
Yeah.
So, anyway, and we're going to be discussing some of these other pieces in coming weeks. But what I think we see overall is that evolution and Christianity don't go together. Fortunately for Christianity, the evidence is very stacked against evolution, and we're just at the tip of the iceberg right now, seeing just how bad it is. It doesn't work mathematically, it doesn't work historically, it doesn't work biologically. At no point does evolution hold up to scrutiny, which is good because if it did, it would be a very, very big challenge to the idea of a creator who died for us, that our whole faith is based upon. So I would challenge you, again, as we're going through these weeks, don't think evolution and Christianity go together, which could be hard for a lot of people to think about because it's a very popular view. But they actually don't make any sense. They're opposites. One is purpose, one is accident. And I think, again, fortunately for us, that the evidence says that Christianity is far more likely to be true. All right, I want to let you go to church before Carl gets mad at me, or be with us as we go. Thank you for letting us be here today. Amen. And if you want to stick around and chat about any other questions, I'd love to answer them. And thank you for being here.